Jó napot kívánok, Pap Júlia vagyok, negyedéves angol történelemtanár szakos hallgató. Köszönöm szépen a lehetőséget, hogy részt vettek ezen a konferencián. Témám jellegéből adódóan az előadást angol nyelven fogom megtartani. I'm going to be talking about the concept of history in US political news. It is by now a truism that political thinking is shaped by history. Political actors, before making important decisions, will often reflect on the history of certain issues in an attempt to make sense and make use of the wisdom of the past. However, this innate human desire is often taken advantage of. Producers of political discourse will refer, instead of themselves, to history as a seemingly objective source of knowledge, drawing parallels between past and the current events in favor of their own cause. In my study, I will be investigating this contemporary American political discourse, which is often present in news media. As a theoretical framework, I used conceptual metaphor theory developed by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. Their theory claims that metaphors are present in our everyday speech, and by analyzing one's system of metaphors, we can get a clearer picture about one's thinking. However, Lakoff and Johnson claim that metaphors primarily stem from bodily experiences and thus are universal. In my study, I will use a modified version of the CMT theory developed by Zoltán Kovács, which places more emphasis on cultural differences in metaphor usage. Previous literature is manifold. I have found general works about metaphors of history. A comprehensive metaphor system for American politics was developed by George Lakoff in his book Moral Politics, with the nation is a family as a central metaphor. His work was one of political philosophy and not based on large sets of data. In my own database, I'm hoping to test his ideas. Research in my topic has primarily focused on speeches of individual politicians, most notably in the work of Jonathan Charles Black. I, on the other hand, would like to analyze the texts of political journalists. My reason for this is that they have more access to the average voter because they are able to produce a text with greater frequency. And also by analyzing a larger group of people and texts, I'm hoping to make my research less subjective. My research is to study the metaphors of history in American political news to shed light on the way history is used in political discourse. I will be interested in how the discourse type affects metaphors and whether there are periods of increased metaphor use. I will be examining the differences between Democrat and Republican metaphor use and will try to interpret what this might mean regarding differences and similarities in their thinking. In my research, I used the method for identifying metaphors developed by the Pragolges group. It works as follows. I first read each article thoroughly and I identified the phrase in which the word history was present. I determined the basic meaning of this lexical item. To make this step less subjective, I used the corpus of contemporary American English and online dictionaries. If I found a meaning that was different from the basic meaning, I marked the item as metaphorical and entered it into my database with the name of the speaker, the writer of the article, the date, the link, and the metaphor or metaphors. The speaker and the article writer were sometimes adherents of different political parties. I solved this problem by recategorizing the metaphors according to the political views of the speaker of the metaphor. I also created a third category for speakers whose political views could not be safely determined or weren't developed enough. In this slide, you can see the number of data I had. In total, I collected 1,000 instances of metaphors, with more metaphors in the Democratic database than in the Republican one. On this slide, you can see the distribution of my data. The spikes towards the end of my data are due to research methodology. I collected data in these periods, and more recent examples were deemed more relevant by the search engine that I used, but the rest are significant. However, they are not due to one single event, rather they are caused by a collection of events from the world of American and international politics, and they are connected to various historical events. When I constructed my database, I took the reading habits of Republicans and Democrats into account. Here you can see two figures from the study of Pew Research Center from 2022 and 2026 respectively. Both represent the fact that Republicans are tightly clustered around one main news source, Fox News. For this reason, I tried to give it the largest proportion in my data. On the other hand, Democrats habitually use a wide range of news sources, which I also try to represent in my Democratic data. Common themes in the articles included history education, especially regarding the sensitive topics which carry political value, such as the history of Black people or the Civil War. Other topics were described with history metaphors because they were deemed by the journalists that they were historically significant. For example, Democratic journalists often emphasize the historical implications of the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The war between Ukraine and Russia was also deemed historically significant. Other historically significant events included the death of Elizabeth II and other historically significant people, and the historically significant elections of people, such as the first person of color entering a position of power. The slide shows the most common metaphors. As you can remember, I had more democratic data than Republican. So to be able to compare the two, I created a virtual democratic database that had the same number of elements as the Republican one, while keeping the proportions of the original democratic database. Thus, on this slide, you can see the results of the virtual democratic and the actual Republican database. As you can see, metaphor usage is generally similar between the two parties. However, there are some notable differences. The metaphor history is a text, history is a book, and history is a story were preferred by Republicans. This is also true for the metaphor history is a person and history is an area. It can be hypothesized that these preferences are due to a more traditional way of thinking, which conceptualizes history as something to be learned from a source of authority, be it a book or a person. Metaphors that were preferred by Democrat journalists include the metaphor history is an object and the metaphor history is a wall. The object metaphor was primarily found in the articles connected to historically significant elections, while the wall metaphor was connected to racial issues in education. In the following slides, I will present the mappings of the most common metaphors. Here you can see the history is a textbook or story metaphor. In this metaphor, a text is a coherent version of history. Writers are the people who created this history either by telling this narrative or by carrying out historically significant actions. Pages are events, while chapters are larger units such as a time period. A footnote is an event of little importance. But this history is not constant, but can be changed, can be rewritten, can be abbreviated, can even be censored. The next mapping is the history is an area, country, or battleground metaphor. In this metaphor, the word is the collective of historic memory or the historical curriculum. Separate spaces represent separate histories of certain groups. There's the right side, which represent the groups of people who made the moral decisions, and there's a wrong side, which represent the people who made immoral decisions. To attack a country is to attack a certain version of history, but this version of history can also be defended. And this war on history represents the ideological fight for a certain version of history to become the mainstream version. The last mapping which I will be presenting is the history is a dark or a dirty object or a dark area. In this metaphor, there's a dark or dirty part, which represent a shameful or negative part of history. A clean or bright part was not found in my data, but it can be concluded that this also exists. That represents the positive part. To clean history is to omit a shameful part of history, but to illuminate a dark part of history is to learn more about the shameful part of history. Personifications were important because they give statement, which is really the opinion of the speaker, an air of objectivity and authority. A personified history can show the parallels with previous events and advise political actors based on this previous experience. In the future, a history person can also look back and remember the actions of the political actors of the present. If they acted well, they can be praised by a personified history, but they can also be shamed by it. By reminding people that the decisions they make can shape history, this metaphor can act as a warning to make beneficial or moral decisions to attain a positive remembrance. In many cases, a personified history can take on more specific roles, figures of power such as a teacher or a judge, but also weak figures such as a child or a sick person. As a conclusion, it can be asserted that the cultural divide that is described in Lacob's moral politics does not seem as wide as he predicted. In many cases, the two parties use similar metaphors and techniques to convince their audiences. The character of their metaphors is similar. They both emphasize the dynamic and narrative aspect of history. But this narrative is not a big and singular one, but there are multiple histories, multiple smaller narratives corresponding to different communities. This, in my opinion, shows a very postmodern view of history. Concern with the shameful parts of history is also widely depicted. The preoccupation with the dynamic aspect is evidently affected by the discourse type. It can be claimed that the subject of the article is a good indicator of whether history metaphors will be used, but singular events do not create spikes in the data distribution one by one. Most metaphors were common to both parties. However, there were some preferred metaphors, such as the area, the person, and the textbook story metaphor for Republicans, and the object and the wall metaphor for Democrats. These preferences give away differences in thinking. For further research, I will be examining the salience of metaphors so as to get a clearer idea of the complexity of metaphors. I am also hoping to examine my pool of data, firstly by including the comments that were made in response to the political articles. Thank you for your attention, and here's my bibliography.